I internalized, I had all these labels, I kept closeted. I was 14 and I remember that I was so suppressed with my not only sexuality, but I was so stressed being in a new high school where I knew that I was not AMAB, assigned male at birth. I never even thought as a kid, despite my community, I never was comfortable with anything called man or manly. I was like, it was natural to me. I didn't have the words for it, I didn't have representation. I was so isolated, I had nothing. And I'm so blessed that I was able to find not only New York people like me and words like me, but I suffered. It made you go through mental health, it made you suicidal ideation, which in...
No, I'm sorry, I didn't want to squeeze and
Sure.
ruin.
I thought you were having a moment for me. So I remember I was 14, I was overwhelmed being in a new school, and my way of dealing with my anxiety and pressures in school was I looked at pornography. And I was eventually caught because my mother has a filter, and she approached me, and I kind of, also before that, I always said as, not even a joking way, seriously, I said, I want to be a girl when I grow up. And I also said that I want to be more myself, and I also said I had to confront her at first, and I said, I didn't really say I'm gay, but I had to at first say that like, oh, kids in school forced me to like look into this, to play a trick on me because I didn't want to be open. And then at first she wanted to ask those kids, and I was afraid for them to give them their definition. And then at some point I was like, this is who I am, Mom, like I like boys. And she just said to me, like the community would say is like, you'll change and you have to give up these ideas and feelings. And my mother was my only support in a community that I felt different, and I was so scared of losing my mother's love that I said, whatever you want, Mom. I will hide and not be myself as long as you'll love me. Like I lived in isolation until I was 18. Again, when I was 8, and then throughout high school, I was called all these names, and I didn't know.
But you went to
a Jewish modern Orthodox school in Queens. And like one in elementary school. I didn't know at the time, I suffered from OCD, and I had extreme overthinking, which I only got diagnosed in 2011. But I was so stuck in my head that until even now, that whenever I have bullying or trauma, I would hear people's voices. So when people called me homophobic words and transphobic words, it was so loud in my head, I felt that everyone was thinking and saying. And then added, when I came to realization of my identity, I feared that, well, if they're labeling me and I happen to feel this way, is their definitions about me true? So I believed it, and it was still a part of me. I was 18, I felt suicidal. I confided in a discreet way to a few religious people. I was looking for a rabbi to help me because I was suffering. And this rabbi who was not educated, who's in Brooklyn, who's really famous, his name is Rabbi Goldwasser, who he tries to be seen as a cool rabbi who uses his tactics to heal people's emotional mental health issues. So like, he's known for like helping religious women with their like eating disorders or whatever. And I came there and he was like, oh, these things go away. And at first I was a little hopeful, but then I'm like, I felt like, no, these things do not go away. And I went to Israel, and I felt like I needed to hide who I was and tried to be religious, and I started throughout high school and even in elementary school, like whether it was my learning disabilities, and then added just feeling bored and uninterested and not connected to the religion and the toxic spirituality I was taught. And again, I felt like if I don't confide in someone, I'm going to take my life. That was in 2011, and I told one rabbi, I told two, and then eventually became a few people who knew, and I felt embarrassed that not only people who knew, but knew about me in secrecy, and I kind of felt stigmatized, and I was forced into conversion therapy.
Oh.
And if you know that, it was basically, it's illegal by all institutions, medical, psychological. I was emotionally, physically, and sexually tortured for 2 years.
Was this done in a camp or what setting was it?
I was forced into these group therapy sessions and going to camp while also being in this study abroad program. So people.
And your mom sent you here?
My mother sent me, and then when she found out what this program was that was about it, she was all for it.
I want you to get into it, but who informed your mom of this camp? Because it sounds like she might have been misinformed.
I did because at some point there was a camp that you needed like $100-something to attend, and I didn't have that money, and I had to tell my mother, and she was all for whatever I needed to do to change myself, to fit in, because her expectation of me was to be this leader that was going to bring her family together and religious and make her proud for what her ex wasn't able to fulfill, and I felt pressured to be this expectation of being the man in the family when all along she didn't know that I never saw myself as a man, I never saw myself as having a religious life, and I really struggled for years to choose, and for a long time I appeased her and the community, and I was miserable. And I was 2 years stuck in Jerusalem, thinking that I had a community, thinking that I was changing and improving, and I was being tortured physically in different ways. And at some point, I just, you know what it was? There was a part of conversion therapy which you could all research, and it's illegal, but in religious communities they still practice it.
And this was in Jerusalem? This
was in Jerusalem in Israel, 2011, 2013. There was a moment where they said in order to be a healthy man, one needed to be toxic. One needed to perform toxic masculinity and these archaic views of masculinity and manhood in order to heal. There was this belief in conversion therapy that your sexuality is due to broken relationships with people of the same gender. And I partially believed it, which got me into it because I was like, my father wasn't around, my brother abused me, men didn't like me, and now looking back, it's because, yeah, it wasn't anything to do about brokenness. They were broken and harmed me, but I was placed in a gender group that it wasn't my gender.
It wasn't your gender.
I was, I'm non-binary and trans-femme, and that's who I am, and in these communities, it was boy or girl. And I was placed in, if I was in a girl group, it would have been way more healthier for me. But I didn't have an arts education growing up. I didn't have a physical education. I had 30 minutes in a locker room once a week. That was my physical education. I did not have tutoring and services for people with disabilities. There was other social services that you get in public schools that this is again part of the fight that if we are funding all schools, religious or not, you need to comply with all the rules and laws in New York City.
Right.
And there are people who are getting away with it and making money, and there are people who join these organizations like Footsteps and Yafed to tell their voices, but again they have so much power and control over their schools that even the school system, the school city officials and the government, like the mayor or the governor, is not even doing so much of a job to investigate and change because they are thinking about community partnership for political power. As much as they're Democrats, they want the power and the vote that the Orthodox Jews have, like other communities, so they're willing to hush-hush on some things to be able to gain their power to stay in power. So whenever you do see like an anti-Semitic hate crime, this is an opportunity for these political leaders to come in and say, we'll protect you, and with that protection, we'll make sure no one touches you when you're problematic. We will make sure everyone look away on other things and protect you.
I do feel that the Jewish community is probably one of the most connected and protected communities.
Well, again,
in New York City, at least, and I'm not speaking just on a religious level because I'm thinking across ethnicities and across other racial groups. I knew growing up, and where Dany and I are from, we're adjacent to a very popular Jewish community in Queens.
We were actually
at Laurelton. So there is a cemetery right there where a very popular rabbi is buried.
So you know,
and so they usually have a lot of control over the neighborhood. They have a lot of police protection because they have these celebrations where they expect him to rise and all these things. And so it's like a part of the town gets shut down.
But also, the community we're from is originally a Jewish community.
It was a white community. Yeah.
It was because that church on 228 was a
synagogue.
A synagogue. Mm-hmm. So that is a historically Jewish community, and what happened? The reason why they moved out was because it became infested with drugs. So they removed themselves from the community, and now it's become one of the most affluent Black communities in the whole of America, to be honest.
So you know, it's funny, that community I told you about earlier that are considered emissaries that Oprah went into. That cemetery is where their late leader, Rabbi Schneerson. Chabad leader, the modern Chabad leader who is buried there. So they come from Crown Heights, always there, and I've also been there. They have a whole setup.
Every time.
They have Crocs there for you to take off your shoes and to walk into the cemetery in a certain way. So there's, all the rabbis do not agree. All the rabbis can't, that kind of helped me realize that there isn't a one way to practice your faith or spirituality in God, because religion is made by man, spirituality is something more divine, and that has helped me in my journey to realize y'all fight and disagree on yourself, and you spend hundreds if not thousands of years writing books about it, and you still can't get along, and still don't have the answer.
That's something that I have used in my faith. I'm Christian, but I am non-denominational because of the fact that I feel like there are certain laws in the Bible, and not even only in the Bible, but that I feel like as a whole that are practiced that don't make sense.
Yeah.
Like one of the laws is love your neighbor, but we can't
love you, but you can't love you.
You can't love this person, and then the overlooking rule is, okay, how could you love? How are you supposed to love your neighbor, but you can't support how they want to live their life?
That's what I always struggled.
I don't understand that.
That's what I struggled with growing up, where there was all these values in my community that said, do charity, love others, be kind, help the blind person cross the street, like all these humanistic values. But then it was not only, it did not apply to anyone who wasn't Orthodox or Jewish, but it was anyone who was just not like them. So I already got the message going in that if I'm Jewish and these rules are not applying to me, but then you're also saying that I'm bad for who I am, then how does this match up? And what I actually took in my traditions is, I believe, like some more left-wing thinking Jews, like Reconstructionist Jews, who believe that in order to be part of the modern world, you have to use their tradition for all. If you're going to fix the world, you can't stay in your sheltered community.
Amen.
And I always had, from a young child, rich experiences of the world by being outside, and I think being representation we know matters, and we know saves lives, and we know breaks down bridges and obstacles. That's the only way you're going to learn from each other. If you stay in your own shelter and you tweet this and you send a social media or send a letter there and shake hands, that's not community. Mm-hmm. And we are all struggling in different ways. And looking outside of the Orthodox community, it's very funny because the Lower East Side used to be very socialist and used to be way more liberal thinking, and those types of Jews who made the nonprofits that service all types of people, you know, like Education Alliance or Henry Street, or different community centers that were working with Puerto Rican activists and Black activists. The Jews that walked with MLK were liberal and modern Jews. They weren't Orthodox Jews because they were like, our liberation is a collective liberation, and we know what it is to be a person that does not have rights in a country and is being persecuted as such. And those people had their interpretation. You did not see any Orthodox Jew, maybe there might have been one, but not that I've heard of or not that you've seen, that have walked hand in hand with the Black community. Now they're trying to use it as an excuse to start building, not because they care about Black rights, it's because they feel that we're now pressured and forced to come out of the community because we're being attacked, and we realize there's not a dialogue, but they're not going to go as far as to shake hand in hand. They're only going to do you stay in your place, I stay in mine, we be safe, we're still going to gentrify, and we're not going to like you, but let's build walls, and that doesn't heal people.
That is strange for me growing up in New York, because every Jewish community that I can think of right now that I'm familiar with is set in a black neighborhood. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it's set in either a black or brown neighborhood. Yeah. So, in the Jewish community, there is a lot of different housing setups in different communities.
Sure.
Where, like you mentioned before, that there are a lot of Jewish landlords, and that's where they make a lot of money. And because they are landlords, there's a lot of segregation in housing. And there is a lot of biases that are passed down, and there's a lot of, I would say, missed opportunities for people who are non-Jew.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
So what is, I guess if you can provide any insight, and because I hate that the only insight that we tend to get is when it blows up in New York Post, where it says, funding that this landlord might have received from the government was not allocated to individuals, where it's supposed to be like helping diverse people, come into low income housing or things like that.
Sure.
They're offering only specifically to their kind.
Sure. So first I was thinking and saying that we know that New York City is one of the most segregated cities in America. It's a city of two cities, the rich, the poor. By racial and ethnic lines, it's so divided. Mm-hmm. You'll still see today in the most liberal areas like Chelsea being mostly white and affluent, and various minorities who have been stuck in poverty being stuck in the same projects, NYCHA, supportive living, that has not been able to cater to their needs, and added how often black and brown neighborhoods and neighborhoods that are low income have been taken advantage of to make room for white individuals. So I wanted to clarify that the housing and the housing segregation issue is not a Jewish versus a black and brown thing. Mm-hmm. I think it's a white versus a black and brown thing, because in Israel, for example, in the 50s and 60s, now my grandparents came from a small town outside of the capital in Yemen, and when the Arab Jews came to Israel, they were put in tenements, and they were put in projects, and some of them were put into these trashy refugee camps for decades. They were not prioritized by the government to gain housing like the white Jews that lived there, or the white Jews that came in the 80s in Russia. So there was a movement in Israel called the Israeli Black Panthers. Mm-hmm. They modeled off of the Black Panthers. Angela Davis went herself to Israel to fight with black and brown Jews for their strive in a white society to be able to gain access to housing and education, while at the same time the civil rights movement was happening and black people were fighting for the same social liberties. So that shows you it's not a Jewish thing, it's a racial thing. And also it's not all Jews, because there's Jews across the spectrum, and there are many liberal Jews and non-Orthodox Jews that have created, through their experiences, supportive housing and projects and trying to fight against gentrification. But most of the landlords that still have a lot of power are often landlords who are Orthodox, and Orthodox people who tend to give to themselves and prioritize themselves. And you were saying earlier, you always see an expansion of mostly Orthodox Jews who come in these black and brown communities, because they're often looking for something. They don't make a lot of money. They're often looking for the neighborhood that's could be developed or project or expanded for them, and then they have so many kids, and then their kids have so many kids, and they keep expanding. A perfect example is there is a very Orthodox Jewish neighborhood outside of the city called Five Towns.
Oh yeah, Five
Now,
Towns.
One of those towns was never Jewish. It was for a few decades Italian and black and brown Inwood. Now, even in Inwood, it is becoming rapidly gentrified by Orthodox families. I remember visiting a teacher that was there, and there still is an area when you come off of the last stop on the A train in Inwood that is it's still underdeveloped, and people have been there for decades, and there's no social services and tackling. And I something that I've observed through my experience is that the Jews that came from European descent, who came into America in the mid to late 19th century and on, at first they weren't recognized as, they were never Caucasian. We need to split the idea of Caucasian and white. Caucasian, is the people that came from Caucasus, and then white is a definition, a construct that was made in the West that was related to skin color and rather than ethnic origin. So that over time in America we know included the Italians and the Dutch and the Germans and even Jews who were white passing who benefited from white privilege.
So wait, the mountains of Caucasus is a real place?
Yes.
Oh wow.
No one lives there, and there's not probably, I probably doubt there's like a huge colony of white people. It's probably uninhabited at this point, but that's where the word stems from.
Yeah.
And the white Jews that struggled to assimilate, who often had to Americanize, their name. My father Americanized his name when he left the Orthodox community, Daniel, so that he could gain certain privileges, versus his traditional name, Yasilevsky, that would have barred him from certain things, like all types of people of color and minorities. So those white Jews that were able to assimilate and be able to access white privilege were able to thrive, versus brown Jewish families like mine and black Jewish families that they were not able to access the same privileges as their white Jewish counterparts. And it is a constant battle and conversation that even in the most left-living, we know white liberals, they're not the most woke. And they still have class and privilege, and they're white picket communities, and they might say they care for us, but they still live and operate separately. The liberal ones we're talking about. And that is the same thing even with the Jewish community, that they don't like hearing me because I'm loud, I'm clear, I talk about my experience, and it often, for me, it's been a struggle because when people approach me and they have misconceptions about Jews, I said, there's a huge community that is not the privilege and stereotypes they're talking about, that I've always been low income, I've not had the same opportunities as white Jews in my neighborhood who go to master's schools and have top jobs and are in the city, Orthodox or not. Also is going to go back, New York in itself has historically been part of segregation and gentrification, because we know that in the 50s and 60s, the first laws about, housing acts, I forgot that, fair housing acts that started to grant black and brown people permission to buy homes were still only in areas that were segregated for them. So in Long Island, for example, there are neighborhoods in various counties that black and brown people were able to buy, but they were only able to buy in that zone. There's a really popular documentary by a trans director called, what is it called? The Island? The One Island? Something like that. Don't judge me, I'm giving you a lot of information, but I don't always remember everything and know everything. But the point is, The Lone Island, you could look it up. But the point is, it was Netflix, it won Oscars, and it was about a crime that happened towards a black man in an area that was segregated in Long Island. And the reason why the police officers didn't really investigate in the murder so much, which was a self-defense act against a racist white patron, was because it was in an area that the society, the white police, considered that if it's a crime in that area, we have reasons to believe that it was a black and brown person that instigated it, and we're not going to be in favor. So there's that whole history, there's that whole racism, there's that whole segregation. We also, again, with various Jews, yes, Jews are one of those people that have always lived to themselves, both for trauma reasons and psychological reasons of always being the outcast, that they've kept to themselves naturally. And the more liberal they are, the more, they live amongst various people, but still live to themselves. I see that firsthand of going into liberal synagogues being mostly white and not living with various people, which is, I feel, again, religion across boundaries divides people more than unites people across the boundaries. It's, again, the gentrification issue is a larger conversation, which is mostly as related to race and power and class, as we know. Mm-hmm. I don't want it to pit it against Jews, because Jews have often been seen as, sometimes Jews are forced into these positions because there is a history where, like in Europe, for example, or even in the Middle East, Jews were denied many types of employment opportunities, and sometimes the only jobs they were able to give in was the jobs that everyone hated from the government, like tax collectors. So Jews have a long history of being the people that had to go around and collect debt and taxes, and as a result experience anti-Semitism because people say they are an extension of the government to try to get money from us and kick us out. So
I typically have seen Jews in positions where they're doctors, medical professionals, if they're in finance, it's something within tax, tax accounting, and within either the landlord system, social services. It's usually within, I would say, career paths that provide some type of help back to their community, because I think, at least from what I've seen, like when I started off my career, I worked for the local government.
Yes.
And in my job, I'm an auditor. So in the local government, I've been exposed to a lot of different things.
Sure.
And a lot of times I've noticed there was a lot of Jews in specific positions where if they were a tax accountant, there's certain things services that they would strictly provide to someone else within their community to get them their taxes, certain credits written off, things like that.
In lines with that, I would like to touch on a story that was very close to me. Sheldon Silver, which you may have heard, was an assembly speaker and very powerful in our state and city governments for decades. He's an Orthodox Jew, and he's one of those Orthodox Jews that, through his family and assimilation, was able to eventually gain access of power, like other people in our court system who are part of the Orthodox community, who work in these civil jobs. And he found ways to, he got caught eventually a few years ago for money laundering $5 million that he was taking out of nonprofits that were supposed to feed the poor and the needy in various communities. And the co-ops that exist in Lower East Side, he found ways to use the law to prevent it ever being gentrified or modified so Orthodox Jewish people could have power and maintain those homes. And I often, when I challenge people in the community and talked about the people that lived here for decades in surrounding areas that are being kicked out, including mine that's Jewish that they might not give a shit about, they would have this mentality even after he was caught for his crimes that, oh, he built this community center and he built this for us and found ways. Right, and those community centers have not even been welcoming always to me, because in 2016 I made a documentary about me living with my disabled grandmother, and we got these leaflets spread to all the homes saying that we are not making our community centers, which they weren't theirs at this point, like at the Education Alliance or Henry Street Settlement, nonprofits that open to all, but because they take up spaces and programs there, they have this idea that it's theirs, and they were looking past the law to even say for their synagogue, which even if I would walk into the synagogue and they might not be welcoming, it's still illegal to discriminate in public spaces for anyone, regardless of race, gender, sexual orientation, class, disability. They wrote in this letter saying that we are not allowing diverse communities and trying to remind their people that we need to segregate ourselves to remain in lines with our tradition. My grandmother was enraged, and I made a whole documentary called Bubby and Them about that, because she was kicked out of her, excommunicated from her community for being an outspoken woman, a woman who's disabled, and as a disabled woman she needed a service dog, and the Orthodox community considers many animals impure and not something that you should have, but she needed it for her health. And if you actually look at the Bible and the Torah, there is a law that says you're allowed to break any law as long as it will save a life, even on the Sabbath. So she's not breaking anything, but this is an example of how Orthodox religions, it's not only Jews, politicize and weaponize their religion as a way of controlling and dividing and preventing minorities from gaining access to power, because that would mean less for them at the table, and added at a time where now they have found ways, and this is the same you could say about Mormons and the Amish and Muslims across America and across Western societies. They have found ways to use civil law to protect them, because now they're not a persecuted religion. They could be a protected class under this country, and they use that to push people like us away.
So you mentioned your grandmother was excommunicated. So I wanted to get into that because that is something that is not often spoken about, and it's kept tucked in and kind of like, quiet.
Sure.
So what does excommunicated mean? To be excommunicated? Like, what does that mean? What does that process look like? What is the results of being excommunicated? And some of the personal experiences, I know you mentioned that you have other people that you associate with who also been excommunicated from their communities.
Specifically, like, how was your experience, and what was your experience with being excommunicated from your community?
I'm so happy that you said to focus on me, not because I'm selfish, but reminding everyone that I, or any of us, are an expert of our own lived experiences. I am not speaking for anyone else. I am also not one of these organizations that work hand in hand and who could give you more of the academic terms, but I could give you the general themes as it relates to me and other people. So one, again, growing up in a brown Jewish family, on considered the wrong side of the block, the brown neighborhood, the poor neighborhood, there was already sentiments that we were the other. It was already sentiment and idea in the white Jewish community, that the Orthodox community, that we're not Orthodox, we're not white, we not have money, we're not the same. I got that message very, very clear as a child, and my mother, despite all that, still had this belief that she said, those people are our people. And I'm like, are they? We speak a different language. We speak Arabic and Hebrew, they speak Yiddish and English, we have a different food, we have a different custom, we have a different culture. They don't see us the same, they don't invite us, we don't have the same access to privileges. This is the ongoing battle that I would have with her, because I was more enlightened. And her mentality, not to shame her, was that she felt indebted to them because she needed to access some resources. So as a result, she compromised parts of her identity. And I was never okay, even as a young child, to compromise who I was. And it took me a long time to split mentally from them, saying I don't need to be accepted by them because I will never get to be me or being embraced. And there are people who try to do that, and I just feel it's a waste of time. So as for me, there was already an idea that we were the other. We were stigmatized in the sense of other black and brown people, that our value was only seen as worth as our form of entertainment and our culture, and not for our wits and not for our other pursuits. So that's really what connected me to a lot of other black and brown folks outside of the Jewish community, was just our similar experiences of racism and colorism and xenophobia. And I am really unique in many ways, and it makes it very hard to often get our community's needs heard, which, as outspoken as I am, I'm learning more to take a step back and to be involved with bigger and greater liberation movements, the Black liberation movement, the queer liberation movement, dreamers, people who have been doing the good fight and are in larger numbers, rather than me going for myself to asking for the government and for our society to give us the same equal amount in schools, in healthcare, in housing, away from environmental racism, etc. And that's part of the community activism and organizing that I do that also incorporates into my artistry.
So being excommunicated.
Sure.
What does that mean?
What does that look like? Well, first it comes with, again, I had the liberty being in a more modern family and being more exposed to the secular world and knowing how to start to leave. I had the liberty to have more of my mental clarity in terms of not being completely caged mentally, but from what I've heard from other people who are more sheltered in the Orthodox community, they first have to learn how to liberate their minds, in the sense that they really need to start defying their leaders and accepting that they won't be welcomed. For some, that means that when you challenge the community, you again lose access to custody of your children, you lose access to your community centers, you lose access for anyone to being able to provide you a good service. There have been women who have not been able to get set up for marriages, who want to stay Orthodox, for just merely saying, I want an education outside of this community. I don't want to have 10 kids. I want an abortion, whatever it might be. In a more scarier sense, there's physical harm. There are I've had the thing that I reminded myself today is that when you're in these isolated communities, it's not just your mother telling you what to do. It's 10 other women who've never been involved in your life who come up to you randomly during the day and saying, you should act this way. You should talk this way. Why aren't you doing this? And I remember I had a woman who came up to me. I've never spoken to her. She's very odd. And this was years after I left my home. And she came up to me and she said, you should be more respectful to your mother. Without her knowing that my mother has abused me physically, without her knowing about the circumstances I have with my mother. But her information was, I'm not Orthodox, so I'm the bad one. And I said to her politely, as much as I wanted to curse her out, I said, your kid is about to run into the street. I think you should prioritize your kid before someone you don't even know your name. Boom. You know, that's an example of how invasive people are in your life. And people trying to control you and shame you and taking on roles within your family that they're not involved. They feel they do not have any boundaries when it comes to your health and your well-being and how you live. They decide for you. But I've also known women who had to leave their communities. They're told, we will not allow you to have a contract with us. We will not allow your kids to go to school here anymore. We will take away your kids from you, whether you're secular, whether you're queer, whether you are not in accordance with the way of our community. We will not support you at all, which then again, what was so unique about the play that I've written, L'chaim to Dykes, was about these women who, yes, were queer and ex-Hasidic and wanted to leave and lost everything in order to be themselves. But then again, if you go watch the documentary on Netflix called One of Us, which got critical acclaim about people leaving their communities, there are people who don't want to leave. They like the religious way of life. They just want to do things a little bit differently. They want to go to college. They don't want to get married now. They want to be able to pursue a career. Those people are also harassed. Those people are also attacked physically, emotionally, and it's more extreme the more Orthodox or sheltered you go. And that's the same thing about Islam and Catholicism and Mormonism. We hear the stories all over the world of what happened to people when they just make their own free choices. And nowhere in the world, as people who inhabit it, no one should be able to say, you need to live a certain way to be able to be safe. That is unacceptable, and that's a human rights abuse.
So that is something that is a huge fear of mine, is because you have friends that are like who are like who are gay or who are trans or whoever who are different, period. And the first thing you think is like, when I was a kid, I used to always say like, yo, I'm so afraid that that maybe like my child may not be per se straight, only because I'm afraid of what someone will do to them. Not because of their preference. I don't care what your preference is, but just to be fearful of
it. To be safe.
of your child's
life.
My
parents had that fear as well, and they've also used it in both good and bad ways to try to make me stay in the closet, as many religious people do. And it makes us suppress who we are, and we're not preferences, these are natural parts of who we are. Right. We're not different, we've always existed in this world. Religion and Western societies and white supremacy has colonized the queer and trans experience. If you look at any Native people in any society across the world, archaeologists have found that the oldest mummy was trans, 4,000 years old. You can't make that shit up. You could go to the Museum of Sex, where they have a whole floor about the science in gender and sexuality and identity and expression in the animal and plant kingdom. You have fish that change their gender to make up a quota. You have plants that are asexual and produce on their own. You have primates that have same-sex relationships, not for the purpose of, I think it's also sex and attraction, but to avoid conflict. This is part of the experience of the animal kingdom, and queer activists always says the only people who don't get it are ignorant, unscientific humans. We've always been here, but whenever a certain religion in power that wants to erase a minority tries to go after them, if you look at the Tainos that were in the Caribbean and Latin America and South America, it was a matriarchal society. Queer identity was celebrated. Trans people across the world were considered shamans and recognized as divine for being what they considered the third gender. It is religion that has enforced suffering and genocide and erasure, and the Republicans are trying to use that as a way of saying family values, or trying to say deviant and horrible, the same way that they said about black and brown people, and still today, of using, instead of saying maybe directly race, as they're going to probably learn one day to not say queer or transphobic things, but to say welfare babies, or, food stamp queen, whatever it might be, the whistleblowers and the racial coding in their language to still target us to prevent us power. And that's what I want other people who are listening, who are not like me, who don't have to be queer, who don't have to be trans, who don't have to be Jewish, to realize always for me that collective liberation is the way that we dismantle white supremacy, is the way that we dismantle patriarchy, is the way that we dismantle a society of bigotry and hatred, and a society that prevents freedom of expression, freedom of individuality, and for me, importantly, freedom from religion. Everyone, in my belief, should have the right to be able to live however they choose, as long as it's not harming others. And when I mean harm, it's not that you're not uncomfortable the way I'm living. I'm not harming you physically, mentally, socially. If you got a problem with it, that's your problem. But I still live in New York City, and I have people who have excuses or try to use body language that they're going to give me a hard time because they're affirmed, because they're not comfortable, whether they're toxic masculinity or their bigotry, and then they feel they have the right to harm me. That is their problem, not mine, and they need to be held accountable. But I'm not part of a protected class federally. I'm not part of a minority that is empowered and privileged that we could always fight back. And that's why it's so important for everyone to hear that we have collective experiences and challenges, and that I come here because your representation is helping my representation. And if we do not work together, we're still going to be struggling to get the white man out of, our superhero comics. So you trying to help me, making sure that I'm being represented fully and authentically, is the same thing that I'm expected to do to make sure that you're seen, because we might come from different backgrounds, but we're fighting the same fight. And people tend to forget that, because when you feel hurt and you then feel isolated, and then you feel you could only trust your own people, which is not always true, because we see that there are people in our own community that harms us, we need to remind ourselves that the fight cannot be done alone. That's what happened with any movement. It succeeds with allies. And people forget the power in allyship.
Yes. So Before we wrap, I really want to just briefly touch on some myths that are taught to other communities who are non-Jew, non-Orthodox. Mm-hmm. And if you can break that down just really quickly before we head out, just so I can, I know people had a lot of random questions about, and it stems from curiosity and not obviously being allowed in this community. So, okay, one of the first things I remember being taught, or at least told about.
It's hot in here, girls.
Yeah, it's a little warm. Again, I'm not taking my wig off.
But you can take your clothes off, right? It's right. Hot in here.
So what the first thing I remember. So I remember people gossiping, because again, I grew up adjacent to a Jewish community, that the women wear wigs because they have to shave their heads the night before the wedding. Is that a myth, or is that true?
So again, I wouldn't say it's a religious law, but it's what the Hasidic people do as form of being extreme in their way of observing, that they took it literally in terms of interpretation. No virgin hair to any man, so let's remove it completely and cover it with something fake and put a hat. So that's an extreme thing that a small group of Hasidic Jews do. It's not true for all of them, and it's not true for most of Orthodox Jews, but it's their way of putting an extreme hold on a tradition that they misinterpret.
Okay, another one. So you mentioned pets not being almost allowed. So I've never seen a Jewish person walk a dog.
I'm not gonna lie.
So again, it's not.
I've never seen a Jewish person with a pet. So are you allowed? I mean, I'm not gonna lie. I had a Jewish VP one time, but he was, I guess, secular. He had a dog.
So yeah, let's make sure.
So who are Orthodox Jews allowed pets?
You should. There is laws in the Torah that says, for example, in Passover, or even in general, it says that you always need to feed your pet first, because that was related to when people were farmers or had cattle, and that was their way for not only business but also for their way to eat, that you need to be able, as part of the religion, to take care of animals. Animal rights is a huge thing in our tradition, because you need to care for the well-being of everyone to be able to be well yourself. Mm-hmm. Again, Orthodox people have changed their way of life over time, that they feel that there's not necessary to have animals now that we're living in modern times. So animals today is not for business, and it's not for feeding ourselves, it's for comfort. And they politicize the comfort as a distraction from their religious way of life. Okay. So it corrupts the idea of telling you that you cannot have it, because they try to find other ways of saying it's dirty, it's impure. It takes us away from being able to study our focus of life. But it's not, especially if you need it as a service dog or to take care of your health, it's completely bullshit. And again, the less Orthodox you are, they're open and fine with it. You know, I've had a bird, I've had hamsters. My mom considers herself modern Orthodox. I've taken care of cats. Other families did not, who are more. So I just want to be able to.
I guess where you are in the spectrum, then that will then determine.
Yes.
How extreme you are.
But again, I want to make sure that when we say the word Jewish, that we know that it's a hybrid word and it's a not monolithic word, because I know when we're talking, you're talking about Orthodoxy and Orthodox Jews, but they are a minority compared to most Jews in the world in America who do not commit the same, I would say, microaggressions and racism, and a lot of Jews who work with various communities because their essential beliefs is about human rights, like me, and working hand in hand. The Orthodox Jews, again, are like the Westboro Baptists, some of them, or the other closed-minded extremes. So Jews is a spectrum. It comes in every color, every shape,
so
every
Orthodox
gender.
Jews, you were raised modern Orthodox, so you were allowed pets. But there are some
in ultra Orthodoxy, they do not have pets.
Okay. So another one, and it's a crazier myth, but I don't know if you heard this, but I remember there was a saying that Orthodox Jews, ultra Orthodox, I would say, when they have sex, that they have a sheet with a hole. I know that I personally know that I believe that's supposed to be a myth, but I still hear people very curious about that. That sounds ridiculous.
It does. It's something.
And I don't know where that came from.
I'm gonna put my theory on it. My theory is that because people on the outside hear that there's so many strict rules about sex, that someone must have conceived the idea that there's a sheet involved. There is no sheet. It's in the Torah that sex, regardless of the gender, I'm also saying it in like a non-heteronormative way, needs to be more intimate, the most intimate when you see each other. Now for Orthodox that means in dim light, because they see it as sexy and you have to do with the other body, but in Orthodox communities, modern to ultra Orthodox, one thing they have for sure is there's no sexual relationship before marriage. That's a taboo. Before marriage, and then even within marriage, it's only done after the cycle of
sometimes 2 weeks out of the month, because 2 weeks out of the month they're not able to touch the wife because
she has a period.
Yes.
And it's considered impure to have sex when she has a period. And in that process, when she has a period, she needs to go to a body of water that is considered natural. We call it the mikvah, that you have in different communities all over the world, where they go to cleanse themselves, as also is done for circumcision for some people, or it's kind of like a baptism that people do, or cleaning your dishes to make it, if you bought it from the market and it's not.
So these are not in homes, these are in the community.
In the community.
So you have to go in, wait, I just want to clarify this. Just go bathe somewhere else?
No, it's a pool of fresh water that people go for specific times to purify themselves and part of the household.
So once her cycle is complete?
I don't, again, I'm not the expert, and I don't have a period.
Can I Google this?
I will send you a video. Oprah did a segment where they actually talked about it and what happens.
It's very sensual and very quiet, but I would think you would need to make sure that you open the interpretations, because there's probably a lot of disinformation.
Yeah.
And the Orthodox people are probably going to gatekeep what they say.
They also aren't touched by their husbands at all.
Yeah,
there's no physical touch. I have my period and you're my husband and I need to pass you a plate, I have to do this.
Yes.
And then you pick it up.
She did her research. Yes.
Yeah.
They would like to believe that amongst Orthodoxy,
it's that serious.
They want to believe it's not only about the period, but they feel that sexual relations and relationships improve by having time and distance and holding on to your desire. Now,
some Orthodox Jews, not to cut you off, the women feel that creates more intimacy for them.
Yes.
So it's no physical touch. So there's other ways to show intimacy. So they'll have conversations, and they'll find other ways to show that their endearment.
So I guess them not touching for 2 weeks makes them more, I guess, horny
yes, that's the idea. But let's also remember that other parts of their body and who they are throughout the year, in order to not only keep themselves modest from the public, but to reveal only what's more essential about themselves for others. So Orthodox women across the spectrum, regardless of style, they have these laws and customs that women, for example, need to be not to reveal certain parts of their body. So they cover their arms, they cover, their breasts, They always, it's the knee or below, depending on the denomination, they'll go lower or higher, what's the texture. That's where the wigs come in. For more extreme versions of Orthodoxy, they won't wear makeup, but the more lighter streams, they'll wear it when it comes to weddings.
Do their children see them? When they come home and they're clothed, they're fully clothed in the street, they have their wigs on. When they come home,
they never show it to anyone.
But their husbands?
Their husbands only even see it in private quarters. Their own children do not see them fully exposed ever.
So they are fully clothed even at home. And with their wig. And then
they might not have a wig, they might have like a turban or something or covering up, but like they have these they have these like robes set to the floor.
I have to watch. Because this is really intriguing, because I'm just thinking to myself, like, how does your child feel intimate with you if they never get to see you?
Well, you have to understand, they're raised this way. So it's raised into a belief where this is normal. Versus where we're raised
where you're born.
And this is the way men speak to women, and that this is, but the downside is you have, especially added if you're queer or trans or you are sexually fluid, you have no sexual health education until you're married, and there are women who have been raped, there are women who have been abused, there are women who did not know what to deal with when they had a miscarriage, no reproductive education or justice. There are queer people who don't know how to have healthy, safe sex and HIV prevention because there is no education that is affirming the reality that we all have as beings, as sexual beings. So that is the harm on the one side, but the other side is they believe that remove that idea completely. They have this weird idea thinking that even with their segregation, even with the lack of information, even with everything else, you're going to eliminate completely out of a human being the sexual desire, which is not humane. We are all sexual beings, but that makes you negate a part of the human, and then you're saying it's only activated in our circumstances, in this room, during this time. Like in a heterosexual religious couple, they're supposed to have their night, and they have their first meet right before they come out and get after their marriage and before they go celebrate with everyone. They're supposed to be in a room called the yichud room. Now the yichud room is meaning like you're by yourself in isolation, and the first time in an Orthodox arranged marriage they actually get to speak to each other after their 1 or 2 dates. And then after that they are told by a counselor, a religious counselor, when and how they're supposed to have sex. And this is terrifying because you've never heard of it, you don't know how it looks like, you're then asked to go by yourself. Luckily no one's coming in and saying like, stick it in there or whatever, but you're stuck now with a gender and a body and your own body, and you don't know how it works, and you don't have a comfortable, and you have to figure it out all on your own. And there's a lot of people that I know that, especially the women, have very traumatizing experiences about their bodies and about sexual health because they are not informed at all, and it's gatekept, and that is dangerous, and that creates some harm.
So we're coming up on time. One thing that we did not cover that I don't want to say I'm educated fully, somewhat educated on, is the matchmaking process. So we didn't really get into it. I know that we really come up on time. We don't have much. We really don't have much time. But the matchmaking is not done by parents. It's done by someone in the head of the community. I don't remember.
Yes. So there's a term.
What happens is they have an understanding of the individuals who are not married, and they matchmake them based on class. Based on
genetics.
There's a specific breakdown of how they match, and so they're essentially set up like they're told this is who you're going to be matched with. you go on dates, they're still limited to, there's no touching, there's no intimacy.
So even this kind of shows you, so you did your research very, very well.
Oh, thank you.
Very, very proud of you. Not the average person outside of the community or even outside the Orthodox community does not know what you just said. I would really love to hear where you got your resources from later. So there is someone called Shadchan or Shadchanit. They are the role makers in the community to do the matchmaking, which has been done for centuries. And that looks like in very many ways for the Orthodox world, the way they've been able to maintain their communities and to determine who is Jewish or not by only doing people in their communities, because there was often assimilation, there was often people converted out, people who came in who wanted to be a partake, and it already conceived this idea of isolation and self-selecting by having the people that they thought they knew who were part of the community, and later got politicized where eugenics was involved. So if you, as an Orthodox Jewish woman and a black woman, you do not have the freedom to marry whoever you want. The average white guy or the most affluent white guy will never get married to you in an Orthodox community because they will say it, but they won't always say it loud. They'll think of you as less than because of your race. And the person that usually gets matchmaked who is considered bad goods are people who are less respected in the community. And they've already normalized it. So the people that are normalized in the Orthodox community across the spectrum, the people that are born in the rabbinic families or the wealthy families are on top. Those who also, there's also a cheap way for some people, especially men, to be able to have a better prospect. If you happen to be really smart and you went to the top school, that's a level of class privilege that allows you to marry anyone. You could have anyone, and it'll women, men, they will be selected to you. And the same thing with the girls, but then also you're expected to come from a good family. A good family is someone who's so obedient to the community, they have no problems. If a girl got raped and it's not her fault, they put the blame and shame on her that she is untouchable. She is bad goods. She is liable. We don't know they do not know the science of someone being raped has nothing to do with whether or not you could have healthy children. There have been stories of people who got raped and who eventually that is what made them have to leave the community because the harm that was done to them. Again, if you had a member of your family who was an addict or an abuser, or if there was something corrupted in their eyes, you would have less of a chance to be able to get married into a good family. So, and you could be the shittiest person in the world and an abuser, but no one knows about it because you're protected by a class privilege or a religious privilege. You could have access to anything. Added, this didn't happen to me because I was in a more modern school, but in the more Orthodox schools, when they are, I would say the end of high school, they take a genetic test for Alzheimer's and other diseases now, a blood test, all of them, and this matchmaker now has a list of who's healthy and who's not, and they pick and choose genetically who can mix and who can be, and then again, whether it's your race or you have a disability, you will be given less than, and it just shows you that within the Orthodox community, there is a whole hierarchy of race, class, disability, and gender that predetermines who you get to have a life with. So you're the extreme is not only that you are already from the moment you're born, your role is set for you, but where your role is set on the hierarchy is set even more clearly for you depending on what you were, just like in anything in life. Where you were born into means the school that you go to, means the life that you took to have, and so that's the way we've adopted.
So you can never really change who you are.
Or you get kicked out, and then you don't get talked to, and then no one has anything to do with you.
So Cleo, we've come up on time, but I really want to thank you so much for being brave enough to come on, and share your experiences and providing all this insight into a community that we have such limited, and it's not a very tangible community. I just am so appreciative for this experience.
Thank you.
Before we head out, I want to make sure you guys tune in to this episode and all episodes on our YouTube channel. Check us out on all platforms: Spotify, Apple, Stitcher, Castbox, Google Podcasts. You can follow me on IG at always_Nas. You can follow the podcast at the Loud Ones Podcast on IG. Twitter is Loud Ones Podcast. Dany, what's your IG?
Danybonaduce.
And Cleo, anything you want to plug? Anything that you want to mention?
Yeah. So 2 things. I wanted people to know that the reason why you don't see a lot of people like me is there's often a safety factor. When we ever go to the media, we have people in power trying to silence us. There were things that today that I couldn't hold myself back from telling, but if it was ever really publicized and someone was really trying to get me, there would be legal consequences that they will try to silence me or trying to deny me of my experience based on legal contracts that I had to sign in order to safely leave. As brave and strong as I am, I've lost a lot in order to become who I am, physically, mentally, emotionally. And then added, if you want to follow my work, you could follow me at mx.enigma, ENIGMA, and see all the beautiful queer Mizrahi artistic shit that I do. And thank you for tuning in.
Yes, thank you guys.
Oh, and one other thing, so Cleo mentioned that she'll be providing us with educational links that we'll leave below in the description box. Just also, guys, this is going to be a 2-part episode because there's so much information packed.
So much.
So definitely tune into part 1. And we'll have 2 parts to this. But again, all informational links will be down below in our description. And again, follow and check out Cleo's beautiful artwork. Check us out on all our social media platforms, and we'll check you on the next episode. Bye, guys.
Bye.